Somewhere in Los Angeles, in August of 1983, Freddie Mercury picked up a telephone and called his manager in England. He was standing inside the home of the most famous man on the planet, in the middle of recording a song with him. And what he said was, "Get me out of here." The reason he gave was a llama. To understand how strange that sentence is, you have to understand who was in the room. It was 1983. Michael Jackson had released Thriller 9 months earlier. It was on its way to becoming the best-selling album in history, and it has never been overtaken. Freddie Mercury was the frontman of Queen, a band that had already sold tens of millions of records and could fill any stadium in Europe or South America. These were not two rising artists trying to help each other up. They were both already at the top. They liked each other, and that part is genuine. Michael Jackson was a Queen fan. He had been to their shows. There are accounts that he was the one who pushed Queen to release another One Bites the Dust as a single in America, which they had not planned to do. It went to #1 and became the biggest-selling single of their career. So when the two of them talked about working together, it was not a label idea. It came from them. In August of 1983, Freddie went to Michael's house in Encino, California. Not a studio, a house. The Jackson family compound with a recording studio built into it. That detail matters more than it sounds because it set the terms of everything that followed. Michael Jackson worked at home, on his own schedule, surrounded by his own things. Freddie Mercury was a guest inside somebody else's life. They worked by most accounts for a single day. In that one day, they recorded 3 songs. There must be more to life than this, State of Shock, and a track called Victory. 3 collaborations between 2 of the biggest voices of the 20th century, laid down in roughly 6 hours, in a house in the San Fernando Valley with almost nobody watching. Any one of them would have been the biggest single release of that year. None of them came out, not then and not for 30 years. One of the 3 was not new. There must be more to life than this was Freddie's own song. He had written it years earlier, and Queen had recorded it in 1981 during the Hot Space sessions, and then left it off the album. So he brought it to Michael Jackson, a song his own band had shelved, offered to the biggest star in the world to see if it could live somewhere else. That is not a casual thing to do with a song. And then the friction started, and it was not about music. Michael Jackson's studio was inside his home, and his home had animals in it. He kept a private menagerie. Among them was a llama, and the llama was not confined to the garden. It came into the studio, not once, regularly over the course of the session. Freddie Mercury had recorded in some of the most expensive rooms in London. He had not recorded next to livestock. So he made the phone call. Queen's manager, Jim Beach, has told this story publicly. Freddie rang him and asked to be got out. Beach asked why. And the answer in Beach's telling was that he was recording with a llama. That Michael was bringing his pet llama into the studio every day, that he was really not used to it, that he had had enough, and that he wanted to leave. The manager came and extracted him from the session. It is a very funny story, and it is almost always told as only that. But there was a second half to the friction, and it points the other way. Reports from around those sessions say Michael Jackson was unhappy with Freddie's cocaine use inside his home. 1983 sits close to the peak of Freddie's excess. Michael Jackson did not drink, did not take drugs, and was famously particular about his house. Both men were uncomfortable. Only one of them made a phone call about it. Put the 2 of them side by side, and the collision makes sense. Michael Jackson at that moment was private, controlled, and living inside a family compound with his mother in the house. His discipline was the entire engine of his career. Freddie Mercury was a man who had built a public identity out of appetite. He was the most flamboyant frontman alive, and off stage he was living accordingly. They admired each other from a distance. Up close, they were incompatible. There was no falling out, though, and that is worth saying clearly. Nobody stormed off. There is no argument on record. What killed the collaboration was ordinary and boring, scheduling, Contracts. Freddie had commitments with Queen. There were complications between the record labels over who could release what. Freddie himself said afterwards that he could not finish State of Shock because he was tied up with the band. That is how these things usually die, not in a row in a diary. And then Michael Jackson finished the song without him. In 1984, State of Shock came out as a single by the Jacksons with a different guest vocal, not Freddie Mercury, Mick Jagger. It became the lead single from the Victory album. It reached number 3 on the American charts and number 14 in Britain. It was the biggest hit that album produced. And somewhere in a vault, there was already a version of it with Freddie Mercury singing that part. Sit with what that means for a second. A song Freddie Mercury had sung first went to number 3 in America in somebody else's voice, while he was alive, while he was watching, and nobody treated it as remarkable. He had walked out. The song did not wait for him. That is the price of leaving a room, and it is the ordinary arithmetic of the music business, applied for once to a man who almost never lost. What was Queen doing in 1984 instead? They were making the works and shooting the video for I Want to Break Free, the one where the band appeared in women's clothes. Britain found it funny. America did not, and their standing there never fully recovered. So the same stretch of time that could have produced a Mercury, and Jackson's single instead produced the video that closed the American market to them. Nobody plans a year like that, it just happens. The tapes went into storage and they stayed there. Not lost, known about. People in both camps knew exactly what was on them, and every few years a rumor would surface that the duets were finally coming. They never did. The rights were tangled between 2 enormous careers and 2 record companies, and neither side had any reason to move quickly. So the most famous unreleased recording in pop music sat in a box, while both of the men on it got older. And there is a third song, which almost nobody ever talks about. The session produced a track called Victory. It has never been released in any form. No official version, no verified leak, no real description from anyone who was in the room beyond the confirmation that it exists. 2 of the most heavily documented performers in history recorded something together, and more than 40 years later the public still has no idea what it sounds like. Whatever is on that tape is still only on that tape. And then they ran out of time. Freddie Mercury died in November of 1991. He was 45. Michael Jackson died in June of 2009. He was 50. Which meant that by the end of that decade, the only 2 people who could have agreed to release those recordings, or refused to, were both gone. Everything that happened to the tapes afterwards happened without either of them in the room. It took until 2014. Queen put out a compilation called Queen Forever, and on it was There Must Be More to Life Than This, credited to Queen and Michael Jackson. The producer William Orbit built the finished version out of the old session material. It was played for the first time on Chris Evans's breakfast show on BBC Radio 2 in September of that year. 31 years after it was sung, both singers dead. And it is worth knowing what that song is actually about. Freddie wrote There Must Be More to Life Than This as a song about looking for something beyond everything he already had. The fame, the money, the crowds, none of it being the answer. He wrote it at the exact point in his career when he had all 3. Then he carried it to the only other man alive who had them on the same scale. 2 of the loneliest famous people of the century, singing that particular line at each other. And the strange thing about it is that it works. It does not sound like an unfinished demo scraped out of a drawer. The 2 voices sit together properly. Mercury's weight against Jackson's lightness, 2 completely different instruments that turn out to fit. Which is the part that stings. The session was not a failure musically. It was a failure domestically. The music was fine, the house was the problem. There is a version of the 1980s where none of this is true. Where Freddie stays one more day. Where the Llama stays outside, or he decides he can live with it. Where the labels sort themselves out and a Mercury and Jackson single lands in 1984 between Thriller and the Works, and becomes one of the defining records of the decade. Nothing dramatic had to change. Somebody just had to not pick up a telephone. But he did pick it up, and he was entitled to. He was a man in his late 30s who had earned the right to work the way he wanted. And he was in a house that did not suit him, next to an animal, being asked to be somebody's guest. He chose his own comfort over an almost certain hit. Most people would call that a mistake. He had enough hits already to be able to afford one. He never recorded with Michael Jackson again. So what survives is one day. One afternoon in August of 1983, in a house in Encino, when the two biggest voices in the world were in the same room and got 3 songs down before it fell apart. Everything else about it is absence. The single that never came, the album that never happened, the 31 years of silence. And the reason the world got the absence instead of the record is, genuinely and verifiably, a llama.